Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the European University Institute for this very important event on a subject that is becoming more and more important, not only in terms of regulation of a very important aspect of social life like communication and media, but also for our political systems. I am particularly glad to note that this initiative has been organized in close partnership with different institutions, Demos Institute, Open Society Foundation, UNESCO, and I think that it's very important also for the European University Institute to create this kind of partnership on an important subject like this one. I had the chance to be the one here at the UI to receive one day during the last summer a call from the European Commission asking this institute to set up a new center, a center for media pluralism and media freedom. At that time it was just an idea, but now we are just witnessing the structuration of this program, which is something very important, not only from the academic point of view, but also for the political implication, as I said before. And let me stress that this conference is also particularly timely in the light of the recent tragic events that occurred mainly in Europe, of course starting from the case of Breivik in Norway and the last dramatic events in Toulouse. But also in other European countries and also in my own country, there have been serious episodes of violence and intolerance towards immigrants and towards Roma people. And one might ask, what is happening to the Europeans? Why these terrible facts are occurring in Europe, considered the cradle of human rights after centuries of conflict and intolerance? Well, everybody realized that maybe hate speech has been underestimated in the past. Now everybody understands that hate speech may be the incubator of real violence. And in this domain, the role of the media is essential. Of course, it is not only a matter of politically correctness, it is about democracy, non-discrimination, inclusion. There are many problems that need to be addressed, not people to be blamed. And there is a need for everybody, for political institutions, for the media, to be vigilant, especially in times of crisis, when resentment and despair might turn into intolerance, suspicion, and above all, lack of trust towards certain categories of people. In a democracy, there must be an attitude to be inclusive. If a democracy stops to be inclusive, it stops to be a democracy altogether. And I would like to thank you all for contributing to this conference, and let me also convey to Mr. Frank Laroux, Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the United Nations, that is with us today. I would like to thank him particularly because it brings this universal point of view to a subject that is globalized from any point of view, and it is not only a regional problem like it could be in the European Union. So I think that for the UI that mainly has an European perspective, to have this touch of a universal standpoint it's really an added value. I thank you all, and without further ado, I give the floor to the next speech.
Thank you, Secretary General. My name is Frank LaRue, and I am the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. But also, I'd like to give you a strong welcome on behalf of Institute Demos. Demos is my institute in Guatemala. I am from Guatemala myself. As you all know, rapporteurs have to work from wherever they can or from their own country. I decided, symbolically for me, it was important to do it from Guatemala because this experience of Guatemala as being a multicultural society with a majority indigenous Mayan population, with 500 years of discrimination, with a struggle for equality of languages, of cultures, of spirituality, was essential in my perspective, and I think it's a perspective essential for the world, especially how to guarantee freedom of expression throughout all minorities or majorities, all sectors of society, whether they be racial, cultural, or religious sectors as a whole. And this is something we do at Institute Demos. We focus primarily in young people and the younger generations to enhance their ability to communicate from theater to radio to television to the use of media and to becoming professional journalists. But with the purpose of precisely, as UNESCO's constitution says, to facilitate the free flow of ideas and knowledge that will build peace among peoples of the world. The Institute Demos, and you will find this in the table outside, we produced a little CD with the two reports, which are on the webpage of the UN as well, but oftentimes people have difficulty in finding them. The report to the Human Rights Council in June, which was the 3rd of June, and the report to the General Assembly in October 20th last year. Both were one, a follow-up to the other, were on internet and freedom of expression, internet being the new challenge. And for me, let me just finalize saying that it was very important at the General Assembly to include, as someone who comes from a developing nation, the question of access and accessibility. This is oftentimes lost when the debate is in Europe or in North America, and my role as a rapporteur was to break the four walls of the Palais des Nations in Geneva and to look at the world, and we have done a series of consultations with the support of OSF and other countries through OSF, and this is one of those consultations, which I think is very, very important to build sort of a worldwide opinion for rapporteurs, like I said, that breaks sort of the mold that has existed in the past. The issue of access, we divided as a result of several consultations, but especially in Africa and in Asia, in South Asia, in terms of access to content freely with no censorship and to all type of content with diversity and pluralism, as the Secretary General was mentioning, in terms of all media, but also access to the infrastructure. This is the economic side of access, which means access to connectivity, to software, to hardware, and other services. It does not make sense to have internet as such an important leap in terms of technology if we don't thrive to make it of universal use, of universal access for all. From the printing press of Gutenberg that only made sense to the extent that books could fall into the hands of every single child around the world. Today, internet is exactly the same challenge. And this, I was posing to the General Assembly within the Millennium Development Goals, which I think are essential. These were the ideas. Today we'll be dealing with hate speech, which is another of the big challenges of the world. So in the name of the Institute Demos, I thank the European University for this effort and OSF for the joint effort of sponsoring this activity, which I think will be very important.
Thank you, Mr. Lalo. I think good morning, by the way. I'm Pierluigi Parco. I'm the director of the new Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom. I think we can start our first section of this program. You have the program with you. This is a beautiful room, but sometimes if you are speaking from different points of the room, it can be difficult to hear each other. That's why you have headphones that you can use to have to listen. If you don't hear very well, you can connect to the right channel and find the right way to listen. This room was thought to be just a room for silence. That's why the hearing is not perfect, because it was supposed to be only one person that would speak from up there. But still is a beautiful room. So we start our program today, and the first keynote presentation will be by Frank LaRue, as UN Special Rapporteur for the Promotion and Protection of the Right to Freedom on Opinion and Expression, and he will talk about international principles and jurisprudence, balancing the protection of freedom of expression with the need to counter and resist hate speech. Mr. LaRue, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. As I mentioned at the beginning, it is very clear that hate speech is an issue that we all have to deal with immediately. When those that drafted the Universal Declaration, and especially the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, established Article 19 with the idea of allowing everyone to access information on one side and to disseminate information on the other, which is, I always say, freedom of expression is one of those rights that you exercise in two directions, in terms of the access of information, which also means transparency and full access to public information, and the right to disseminate opinions and ideas freely through any media or any means that one desires. This is also a foresight of those that drafted the Universal Declaration, because in those days no one could foresee the development of internet or the new media and the possibilities of expansion of the message. Why do I mention internet in this? Because I think it is the role of internet that has many issues related to the promotion of good consequences, but also to the misuse for negative consequences, including hate speech. In the past, all the technological developments from Gutenberg Press that I mentioned to Marconi developing the radios and using the electromagnetic frequencies, to then moving on to the television and radio and satellite communication and cellular mobile phones, the difference was that it was either a one-dimensional communication in one direction, or two individuals conversing, or maybe one small leap was a conference call where 3 or 4 people could be having a conversation. But what did internet introduce as a new element? Internet introduced the fact that it was in real time communicating with the entire world with no boundaries and specifically no frontiers from any country to another, but also, and this was the most important element, it became an interactive form of communication. Anyone could send a message to millions of people around the world, or thousands of people in their own home country, and they could at the same time receive a response from those thousands of people, or individuals that received that message could interact among themselves. It is this interactive nature of internet that makes it such an attractive and important feature that has multiplied geometrically the effect and the impact of communication. Now, this has many problems. One is the fear that it has put into politicians, because clearly it is an instrument of citizen participation, I believe, and it is an essential element of any democratic society. But at the same time, it brings with itself deeper knowledge, more transparency, and a stronger possibility of criticism. Now, this again does not fall well with especially those that would like to have a more authoritarian, hidden, silent, shadowy form of government. So it's opening the world. So in general, I defend internet as this wide open space that should have very little very few limitations. I always use, in Spanish, we even have a journal called this way, but in Spanish we always use the analogy of it's a plaza pública, or in Italian they would say a piazza. But the idea is that this is the space where people can meet, can relate, can mingle, can converse, can exchange views, can exchange criticisms, can joke, or just interpret one to other's ideas. This is very important, and the importance of freedom of expression in general, with all mass media, whether it be written press to telecommunications, but now with internet, is precisely the openness and the freedom with which it operates. But obviously, we're falling into two challenges today. One, we were talking with Aidan yesterday, and I'm sure he will mention it. One is that there is many precedents and governments around the world, or societies, arguing what happens to the responsibility of the press and the use of responsible mass media, what happens to professional ethics in this world. I have insisted, I have a big debate in my own country, Guatemala, on this, because some of the media outlets have sold out to the mining industries and are criminalizing local Mayan indigenous communities. And I have myself in a difficult position, having to defend their right to speak freely as media, but at the same time calling upon them to do it professionally, to do it objectively, and to do it with a voluntary code of ethics. I always agree that ethics only makes sense as an absolute voluntary nature, and the state should never fall into any form of censorship. But that does not mean it doesn't exist. It does exist, and it should be very clear and present in all the coverage that it uses. With internet, we have the professional media that's now going online, but we also have citizen journalists, people that are documenting events and facts, who are not trained professionals, who are not necessarily professional journalists, but who are actually doing a favor to the information, the right to information that we all have. But the second pitfall in this, in the misuse of all media and of communication, is the incitement to hatred. And I think this flows in the history of the world with waves. There are moments of advancement of peace and democracy in the world and better understanding. And there are moments when we go deeper into crisis. Normally, economic crisis will bring with them social crisis, in which migrants will be seen as enemies and will be stereotyped, or effectively will be harassed physically. When I came into the mandate, when I was elected by the Human Rights Council, my mandate began on August 1st of 2008. Little did I know that the biggest debate that I was going to find was the sort of confrontation that in general appeared to be a religious confrontation between the Muslim world and the West, and the Christian world of the West. It was certainly no religious confrontation, it was strictly a political confrontation, but initially it was presented in that way. And the question was whether I would include in my mandate the concept of defamation of religion. And it was very, very difficult, but I maintained my position with the Islamic Conference. I maintained a position of dialogue, of proximity, but I never accepted defamation of religion, which did not exist. I said, you cannot censor communication on the basis of religion, of any religion. Allow the debate. I do believe that there are stereotypes, and I do believe you're suffering the stereotyping mode of the world, and I do believe that you're being compared to international terrorists just for being Muslim. I understand that, and that has to be confronted, and we have to challenge that, but never through censorship. Now I find myself in a more complicated position, because beyond the stereotypes of that moment, we have moved into massive acts of violence, like what happened in Oslo by this Norwegian man against children to protest the policy of migrants, or what just happened in Toulouse in France against Jewish children in their school. And it brings back sort of this fear and the panics of issues that we thought had been closed with the chapter of the Second World War, or with the war in the Balkans, or with the genocide of the Armenians. we always thought, or in Rwanda or another place, we thought that xenophobia and racism and all forms of cultural and racial discrimination were over. Well, it kind of reminds us that it's not. That struggling against discrimination and racism and violence is a permanent task. And I think we neglected this task for some time. And it also points out how those of us who defend freedom of expression, and we have to continue doing that, freedom of expression must not suffer as a right the consequences of some people misusing it, but at the same time we cannot ignore it. We can't hide our head in a hole because we're defending freedom of expression, pretend to ignore that there are elements of hate speech in different ways, but especially today in internet. The biggest problem for developed nations in the use of internet is when number one is combating terrorism around the world. I have no way to estimate whether that danger is real or not. But the second element, and I find this constantly, is the bullying among children in their own societies, in their own communities, and in their own schools. Because there's a difference. Because someone is heavier and fatter, or because someone is from a different race, someone is a migrant, or someone has a different culture or language. And bullying is precisely the expression of what our societies are allowing. So here's where we have to engage in preventing hate speech. But the challenge is, how do we prevent hate speech without affecting and harming freedom of expression? Article 20 of the ICCPR is fairly clear. And one of the big contributions of the general comment number 34 that just was released by the Human Rights Committee was that Article 20 has to be interpreted in relationship to Article 19, first of all. Article 20 per se on itself makes no sense. This sounds very simple, but it's a very important contribution, because first you affirm the right to freedom of expression, which means to seek and receive information of any kind, and then to disseminate and impart information, opinions, and ideas in any way. Now, the affirmation of that right comes first. And secondly, the fact that we have to look at some limitations. Limitations, as Article 19 points out, should always be in line with the protection of other rights. And here we go through the three-part test that we have always established. All limitations should be established by law, a prior law, unambiguous law, a very clearly defined law, which should be considered an exceptional law, not the norm, but the exception to limit. Number two, the application of this law should be understood always for the protection of other people's rights. Always. That's the fundamental issue. And third, the application of this law and these limitations should be always necessary, absolutely necessary to protect that right, and proportional for the protection of that right. This is crucial. Oftentimes we forget. I did a work in one of my reports expanding these three basic principles of limitations to using more closely defined, to using the Syracuse principles on interpreting the ICCPR, on how these laws should be, how the fact is that they should normally, principally be applied by the judiciary and never by an administrative political body of the state. There's a series of little principles that derive from this three basic point test. But if we stick to these three basic points, I think we're in the right road. Now, some prohibitions, and this is interesting and I mention it all the time, come from human rights instruments themselves. The Convention on the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide says that all states should prohibit incitement to genocide. The optional protocol on the Convention of the Rights of the Child says that all states should prohibit the fabrication, elaboration, commercialization, dissemination, and distribution of child pornography, because it is normally linked to child prostitution, child exploitation, and child trafficking. So clearly, these are prohibitions established in human rights standards because they're essential to protect a certain sector of the population and their rights, in this case children, or to protect populations and peoples of the world from genocide. But And you have the Article 4 of the CERD, that no race should use language establishing their superiority over the others. And then you have the recommendations, which I tragically always say there was only left as a recommendation, not as clear obligations of the state. But in the CEDAW, in terms of all the language and all the messages of gender superiority should be banned from our public discourse. So these are issues that come from international doctrine and standards of human rights. But today, we're going even further to more specific issues, even further into these elements of discrimination, these expressions of racism are falling into the incitement of violence. This happens specifically against migrant populations around the world. This would include Europe, but it would include Asia, would include Latin America, any part of the world. And the reason is when there's an economic crisis, no one wants other people from other parts of the world to come and compete for jobs and to have those jobs even if they're paid lesser salaries. And then the attitude is to respond with this level of offense and xenophobia. And in terms of religion, which we thought it was a crisis solved during the Second World War, and certainly Bosnia reminded us very painfully that it wasn't, but it is still very clearly the intensity of this crisis there. I just met recently with a Buddhist monk from Burma who was forbidden to speak out by his own peers, by the Council of Monks of Burma, because they don't want to offend the military government. They're scared. So in order to not go into crisis with the government, they silenced this particular monk, who is also the director of a Buddhist university. So they're silencing their own peers just to appease the mind of governments that have essentially a racist attitude there, because it has to deal with the difference of ethnic groups within Burma. So I think this is the right moment to look at this issue. I always caution that we may overdo it. I mean, the crisis is real, and it is now inciting to violence. But at the same time, we must always be very careful and cautious to leave the right intact. There is a contribution, and with this I will finish. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN High Commissioner, Mrs. Pillay, organized last year 4 consultations of states with some academics participating in 4 different regions of the world. And this year they're going to have one final, this was not in the calendar, but they added one final wrap-up in Morocco, which will be coming up sometime in the next half of the second half of the year. But in those consultations, a very big contribution. They invited all 3 rapporteurs on freedom of expression, myself, freedom on religion, Mr. Heiner, and the rapporteur on racism and discrimination and xenophobia, who in those days was Guy Tumugai, to participate in all these consultations. And we all agreed that on one hand, we do have to look at the obligation of states to prohibit. Doesn't necessarily mean criminalize. Not all prohibitions have to become criminal law. And as a matter of fact, one of the calls we're making this year is to decriminalize freedom of expression. For instance, to decriminalize defamation and libel, to allow the defamation to be only a civil action and not a criminal action. Because what we also see in the world, because of the fear of internet, is an excessive use of penal law and the criminalization of free speech, and especially the criminalization of journalists. So on one hand, we can't fall into that trap. But on the other hand, we do believe that there should be very clear prohibitions. And there, in no way should any state allow any form of communication to carry racist speeches or messages or any other form of discrimination and hate speech, whether it be not only for race, but it could be for religion, nationality, or language, which is what's established in Article 20, but I would add it could also be for gender in the machista tradition, in the male and patriarchal tradition, or it could also be the hate speech against sexual preference in different social groups, or it could also be hate speech or incitement to violence against children. and other age or elderly people. It is very clear that today we should never allow, and there should be a very clear line within the ethics of the media, on one hand, to not allow this content, but also within the possibility of the states to prohibit these messages without falling into creating a censorship mechanism, which is the other side of the danger. I don't believe there should be a sort of a commission of every executive branch in the world trying to establish exactly what is a speech and what is not. And one of the forms to do this, and this was a contribution by Article 19 specifically, was to raise the benchmarks. For instance, those prohibitions of hate speech should have certain definitions: imminent danger, the possibility of converting themselves into violence, and the real incitement to violence, the possibility that violence may occur, that the context for violence is a favorable context for that, that forms of discrimination can be real because they are part of the tradition. There is a series of standards that should be accompanying these prohibitions to make them acceptable. It's not just a matter that any state can invent prohibitions, because this would be a very dangerous feature, but it's more to clarify which are the specific benchmarks that we should follow in establishing these prohibitions from the future. I think that the mechanism should never be under the executive branch, should never be a political institution of the state. I think these mechanisms should be an independent structure, a mixed structure of state and society, but not related to the executive in any way, but with an independent form, to at least qualify and do recommendations on these matters. And I also think it brings us back to the challenge that the IFJ had launched a few years ago on developing new codes of ethics of media as a voluntary mechanism, but to also bring the standards up to level with the challenges of today. Thank you.
We move to, thank you. We move to the second speech that will be given by Aidan White, Director of the Coalition of Ethical Journalism, that will talk about Europe Now, a comparative overview of legislation on freedom of expression and the prohibition against incitement, challenge to structural pluralism in media, and how the digital environment both aids a pluralism of voices and abets hate speech. Aidan.
Thank you very much indeed, and thanks very much for the invitation. I'm really very pleased to be here because I've been working a little with the Mediva project and the work that has been done in sort of analysing and preparing reports on the current state of European media in particular, on issues of diversity and so on. My name is Aidan White. I'm formerly General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists, and I left the IFJ after almost a quarter of a century last year. I'm now working for a group, which is a new group, called the Global Editors Network, which brings together editors and executives in media across all media platforms. And the intention is of the creation of this group, which was launched last year in Hong Kong, is to try to create a new movement within journalism, which is breaking out of traditional models. And what I want to speak about really is that that set of challenges about how we break with models of the past in conditions which are absolutely, profoundly different for now and in the future. I want to talk a little bit about what I call, we're living now in what I call the era of open journalism. It's a new period, it's a new epoch in the way that information is used and so on. And I think it's a great moment of opportunity, but I think also, you know, it's faced with enormous challenges. And because we're focusing this discussion on Europe, and I'm grateful very much for Frank's overview on the global scene, but here in Europe, I think we have enormous specific challenges which really we need to address. In Europe today, it's very, very difficult to talk about the realization of the aspirations for good conduct, good ethical and moral behavior, not just in journalism, but actually across in all levels of public life and public affairs. Because there is these are deeply uncertain times in which we're living. It's not just the question of austerity, in which the community at large is really living through difficult times. We have almost political paralysis at the highest level in many parts of Europe, including within the European Union. You have political drift, or you have a shift to more extremist political ideas, which are opening up more opportunities for hate speech, for more divisive comment, for much more narrow and polarized opinion. There's more racism. We see the response to terrorism and acts of violence is immediate and hard in terms of constraining people's rights, people's liberties. I think the fact that Nicolas Sarkozy was so quick, even though it's in the midst of an election campaign, to immediately talk about criminalizing access to the internet, the right of people to go and see certain internet sites, sort of shows that the impulse in politics, in mainstream politics in Europe today, is constraint on speech and constraint on civil liberties. There's increased surveillance of citizens and particularly of journalists. There's an atmosphere in which journalism is practiced, which it makes it far more difficult than it's ever been to try to create an informed basis for discussion, a pluralist basis for discussion, which can give people the confidence to participate in the democracies in which they're a part of. So this context, I think, is extremely important for us. And of course, we can't ignore the fact that within Europe, there is a big and strong debate now about the future of multiculturalism, about the question of where we are going in terms of our communities. How do we define ourselves? What is the meaning of identity of individuals in the Europe of today? How do we see ourselves in the future? So that question is, are we moving towards forms of assimilation and integration, or are we moving towards the creation of ghettos? Because we're moving away from the notion of multiculturalism, which has characterized the nature of European development in recent years. So on this side, you have an enormous sort of range of problems, and a range of problems which anyone with a scintilla of common sense would recognize requires an information environment which is as strong as possible in giving people information that they need in order to navigate through this range of problems. If people aren't informed, then inevitably they are unable to take part in the decision-making process, and they inevitably become vulnerable to easy solutions and scapegoat ideas from unscrupulous politicians and so on. And we're seeing that in practice. And one of the reasons why we don't have an informed environment in which media play an important role is because we have a media crisis itself. And this media crisis, I think we also have to address, because it's in this media crisis that we see the challenges of redefining what we need for the future. And this media crisis is driven, we all know this, by changes in technology, changes in the way that the people receive and disseminate information, changes in the way that people communicate with one another, changes in the media market, which have seen the destruction completely of traditional market models, of the media being divided into a sort of a coherent notion of the press and broadcasting and so on. We see the destruction of the traditional role of journalists and the notion of who is a journalist and how a journalist works and how a journalist is defined. We see great precariousness in the way that journalism is operated, more freelances, more uncertainty, terrible sort of problems of poor working conditions, all of which make journalists themselves vulnerable to external pressures and so on. We have less investment because of the declining traditional markets in traditional journalism. We have less investment in training. The reports which have been carried out in the Mediva project revealed this crisis of training, this crisis of commitment inside existing media to be able to sort of sustain the resource base that is necessary for good and informed journalism. We have less investigative journalism. We have less inquiry, less time spent on getting information. I always say that ethical journalism is thinking journalism, but if you live in a time of media production when there is no time to think at all because you're rushed to get information, there is a culture of haste in the way that information is produced, how on earth can you get time for ethical reflection, verification of information, verification of images, the ability to attribute with information that's being published and so on is absolutely vital. So all of these problems come together at the same time. And Frank refers to the notion of interactive journalism, possibly the greatest challenge of all, because the notion of the traditional journalist is constantly under question. Who is a journalist? I'm constantly asked. What is journalism? I'm also asked, you know, is journalism dead? You know, the usual questions. I mean, and always my response to it is far from being dead. Journalism is alive and well, and it has to be nourished and strengthened because there is no future for quality journalism in a democracy without good journalists, without well-trained, well-informed journalists with courage and the capacity to investigate and ask searching questions of people in power. And that's absolutely essential. So there are a range of problems that we have to look at. And I think we're beginning to see that media itself and the future of media itself is becoming a battleground for change and political change here in Europe. We see this now. We see it in the debate, the strong debate that's taking place in Hungary about the role of media in Hungary, independent media, where you have a government which sees itself with a mandate and an authority to seize power in all sorts of different levels, but which refuses absolutely to be held in check or to be held in account by an independent media system, and seeks therefore to impose constraints on how that media operate. And this in the heart of Europe, this in the European Union of values, it seems to me to be sort of profoundly worrying. But we see there are reasons for, in this battleground, there are opportunities. I read in the papers this morning that Mr. Putin, when he came to power in 1999, one of the first things he did was to neutralize the emerging free media in Russia and immediately substituted inquiring, tough broadcasting institutions, immediately replaced them with fluff, with entertainment-based, with weak and soft journalism, to the extent that there was little capacity for criticism, and has been over the years, for the political elite. That is being challenged today. Today we see with the reform movements are basically sort of taking them to account. So here we have a range of problems, and so therefore one of the reasons when I left the IFJ and I wanted to get into ethical journalism is I wanted to talk about this question of ethical journalism, not in some theoretical basis about the question of how it fits in with our mass communications studies and theories and so on, but actually how it absolutely taps into the necessity in modern society for a more moral base for the conduct of public affairs and a more sort of ethical and moral sense of how work is done. So this question about the need for change begins, in my view, with a sort of reaffirmation of the moral and ethical base. And I was taken with a quote, which I just read in the papers this morning, from an opposition figure in Russia, who said, the law of morality and journalistic ethics must take precedence over servility and financial dependence. And I think that if we sort of follow such a sort of a notion, it immediately helps us to understand about what we mean by open journalism and what open journalism should be. So what do we mean by this notion? First of all, I think open journalism is about a commitment to transparency, absolute transparency in the way that media are owned, managed, and operate. Who owns media? Where does the money come from? What are the political attachments? What is the role of media? This need for transparency is essential. Even in the Europe of the European Union, there are major media in many countries. People don't know who they're owned by. People don't know where their money comes from. People don't know who are the people on the boards of directors. People don't know how they operate and so on. So if you have even the media system existing in a sort of shadowy world of secrecy, how on earth can you expect such a media system to deliver the clarity and sharpness that people need to sort of have in reporting in public life? Secondly, the commitment in open journalism, you have to have accountability. an absolute sense that media do not operate in an unaccountable system. Media and journalism is no longer the operation of elite groups in society, standing aloof from the rest of society, passing judgment, making an analysis and commentary which is distant from the realities that people actually, their lives are being lived. So accountability is the key issue. And thirdly is the question of pluralism. The need for pluralism, reaching out, ensuring that all voices, including minority voices, are heard and are actually part of the process. So these values of transparency, accountability, and pluralism are important, and particularly when we're moving into a more digitally driven world and so on. And open journalism, I think, is about journalists themselves saying, you know, I'm ready to speak and to be held accountable for what I do. I think one of the best examples of it in practice, on my old newspaper, The Guardian, this last weekend, they had what was called an open weekend. I mean, extraordinary. It would never have happened in my day on The Guardian, I can tell you. But it was just fantastic. What they did is they opened the office. They said they hired local pubs and local clubs and they brought in speakers. They got all of their main journalists in every area of work, art, culture, sport, entertainment, got them into seminars, got them talking with people. More than 5,000 people turned up over the weekend to talk with journalists, to talk with politicians, to talk with opinion leaders, to explore what the newspaper is doing, what is its aim, what is its ambition. Suddenly, this was journalism out of the newsroom, out of the closed environment of the editor's news conference at 11 o'clock every morning when the big decisions are taken about what goes into the newspaper, but actually reaching out and embracing the community. This is open journalism in practice, it seems to me, and it's part of that process of journalism forcing itself out into the open. So this question of open journalism is also absolutely based upon the notion of, as I said, accountability. And so how do we look at accountability for journalism and media in these days? It's very difficult. One of the problems is, and we have to address it, if you want a media in the public information space which is pluralist and which is system democracy, who's going to pay for it is a question you have to answer. If the public sector, and this is the problem in Europe, if the public sector is no longer willing to invest in pluralist journalism, the question, if the private sector is no longer willing to invest in pluralist journalism, the question is, who is going to pay for it? Who is going to invest in it? And it has to be, therefore, a new vision of public investment. How do we see public investment in a new environment? It's not just a question of public service broadcasting. Public service broadcasting, it seems to me, is in the twilight years of its existence in terms of how it's been seen, it seems to me. Public service broadcasting in many parts of Europe is actually not very good at all. Sorry, it's hopeless. Sorry, it's actually in some cases almost directly governmental in its approach and so on. So we need a transformation of public service values in media which goes beyond just a traditional notion of public service broadcasting as we've seen it and looks out in a more open way for new forms of funding and so on and so forth. Most important, it seems to me, is the question of regulation, a new view of self-regulation. Regulation is about codes, and I agree with Frank about codes, but actually I'm not in favor of making new codes. I take the view that we have more than enough codes. I mean, if I go look around the world, we've got 400 or 500 different codes of ethics that exist. So you can rewrite them, we can tweak them here and there, we can edit them and so on, but actually we don't need new codes. What we need is systems of implementation, adherence, helping to raise and rekindling the notion of mission in journalism and so on. So we need self-regulation which has to be internal and external. So how do we create that? And one of the campaigns I'm involved with, I'm the director of a group called the Coalition for Ethical Journalism, which is seeking to promote debate about how we introduce good governance and ethical standards inside journalism. And that's about getting codes to work inside journalism. I also think we have to look for new controls on media monopolies. It's been clearly pointed out and clearly revealed by the Leveson inquiry in the United Kingdom that, when a media monopoly reaches a certain level of power and influence, it is inevitably a corrupting force in society. And the fact of the matter is, The Murdoch affair in Britain has proved to be the smoking gun of media monopolies and the power of media monopolies. Corruption, bribery, undue influence at a high political level, systematic censorship, internal self-censorship and so on, ruthless behavior inside the newsroom and so on. It's absolutely unforgivable. And it's not a matter, therefore, of tweaking self-regulation groups such as the Press Complaints Commission, which I'm happy to say in the United Kingdom has dismissed itself, having been revealed to be completely useless. So it's not entirely, it seems to me, possible for us to rely only on voluntary systems. Of course we must have voluntary systems, and voluntary systems must drive the whole ethical basis. There's no question about that. But a self-regulating external body must also be something which has maybe a degree of power. And that power maybe have to be defined in law. It doesn't mean we need media law, but however, I think there is a case for saying that a good self-regulating mechanism should have some limited legal authority to carry out investigations, to enforce its will, and this needs to be defined in law. The reality of it is this: if the Press Complaints Commission in the United Kingdom had the right in law to be able to investigate what was going on at Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, much of what we have heard in recent times may not have actually come out in the way that it could have been properly investigated. But no such powers existed. So I think there is a case for some form of co-regulation in which there are limited, narrowly defined powers for self-regulators and so on. So, and my final word is this. I think we have to be careful about getting into the debate about regulation, because self-regulation very often, and only using the narrative which suggests that self-regulation is about policing media and policing journalism. Of course, there is a need to mediate disputes between the audience and media. But I think a good self-regulator, a good self-regulating body is more than just a police authority for journalism. It should be an advocacy body. It should be promoting the enabling conditions for good journalism. It should be about an education body. It should be promoting media literacy in society. It should be engaging in dialogue with the powers that be. Of course, it should be mediating disputes and trying to reconcile disputes and avoid going to courts, which I think is absolutely vital. And it should be also involved in monitoring the state of the media and providing reports. And of course, it must be active in public engagement. And so there's a range of different roles that need to be put together. And I think finally, my final point is this, is that as I've said already, I don't believe that these issues are only to be seen in the, and this is a wonderful hall, I have to say. It has a sort of a real academic sense to it. Quiet. I feel as though I'm shouting extremely loudly in this wonderful sort of cloistered atmosphere. But we have to take ethics and make them meaningful to the reality of people's lives. To say that they represent a sense of morality and a sense of being together in society which is worthwhile and which is worth fighting for. And so therefore we need a new narrative about the importance of ethical information and how European society is informed. And I think therefore if media are a battleground for reform and change, it's absolutely important and vital that we put the question of ethical and moral conduct in media, from the boardroom to the newsroom, absolutely at the center of that debate. Thank you.
E dov'è il coso che non ce l'ho? Sì. Sto dando tempo per questo. Yes. Well, as a third intervention, I will present now the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom that we are building at the European University Institute. And so this will be an introduction to the center work on media pluralism and media freedom. Let me first mention that the center has been established at the beginning of the year and is co-financed by the European Union. As Secretary General Ferrara was saying, this was an idea of the European Commission to have a new initiative on media pluralism and media freedom. So the issue we are discussing today were felt last year by the Commission as essential and urgent. And so the Commission asked to build this new center and decide to co-finance it. Let me briefly explain where this center has been organized. The center has been put within the European University Institute that is presided by President Borrell. Just for the one of you that don't know well the Institute, let me simply say that the Institute is a university. It's probably the only true university of the European Union, owned by the Union, by the member states. It operates through different normal departments, traditional departments like law, economics, political science, and history, but there's also a special Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies that is an interdisciplinary research project. It is a special department that operates by projects. Among the other projects within the university, we have the Max Weber and Jean Monnet programs, important postdoctoral program, among the largest in Europe. And the Institute is also the place in which the historical archives of all EU institutions are located. Within the Robert Schuman Center, as I said, directed by Stefano Bartolini, Professor Bartolini, we have a series of main objectives: produce high-quality research, collaborate with other centers of research excellence, provide opportunities for young scholars working in our core areas, and promote a dialogue with the world of practice. These are the objectives of the Schuman Center. So the Schuman Center works by projects. There are many very well-known projects, some are even new, but the global governance, the Florence School of Regulation, that is a major project on regulation in all the regulated and network industries, the European Union Democracy Observatory, the Consortium for Applied Research to International Migration, and many others. The Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom is become a new project of the Schuman Center at the beginning of the year. The center is connected in a way to the Florence School of Regulation that is directed by Jean-Michel Glanchamp, and the main areas are transport, energy, and communication and media. That is a clear connection with the center because it was already working on the issue also of media regulation, and that's probably one of the reasons why the Commission found that the Institute had already competencies and resources to work on to create the new center. Actually, there is a connection always within the Robert Schuman Center between the Florence School of Regulation and its own scientific committee, and some of the members of the committee will be around here, and the new Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom that for the moment has been based on an initial group of experts. At the moment I'm directing both organizations. The group of experts that is starting the center is listed here, but however is a starting group, experts of different countries, of different competencies, legal, economics, technological, but we have to enlarge this group to journalists, to other experience, to media practitioners, so it's a group that is going to be expanded in the next weeks and months, and some of the people of this group will be at this conference and will contribute. There is a residential team of the center that is listed here. Some of these people are very useful. We have already met them, and you'll meet them if you need something here in Florence. Then let me quickly go through what we think are the main themes on which we will work. There is a group of themes that we call prerequisite. The first probably is the prerequisite for media pluralism and media freedom. The first is the legal framework. We are going to work on the national, EU, and international legal framework, also on the laws, but also on the case law and the practices through Europe. And then we are going to deeply work on the legal aspect of and competencies respect to media pluralism and media freedom, the monitoring and assessing media pluralism, the state of all the kind of regulatory authorities that are in the sector, the national specific legislation, and important, the EU influence on the evolution of these issues in Europe. Another prerequisite that we find very important is the demand for media pluralism. We want to have an observatory on understanding how media freedom and pluralism are perceived by audiences, the effect of consumerism, information flow, audience empowerment. This demand side question is also for us an interesting and important prerequisite. Then we go to the core of the activity of the center. Among the core activity, we see the media governance, media accountability, ethics and trust in journalism, the rights of media professionals, and the question of quality journalism. That's one side. The other side is the governance of publishing and journalistic activity. We want to look at the media enterprise, the relation between managers and editors, codes of conduct for editors and journalists, defamation rules. We think that the media enterprise is a special enterprise, that need to have special rules, and we looked upon at these special rules. Then a specific emphasis will be put on investigative journalism and media freedom. Investigative journalism, the business model for investigative journalism that is changing in this changing environment under the influence of current trends, of the effect of the new technological developments. And then there is always important legal aspect of investigative journalism, the equilibrium between the laws that defend against that have to defend the possibility to have an investigative journalist that controls power. So media governance is one of the two important sides on which we want to concentrate. The second, probably general side on which we want to concentrate is media economics. We want to have a deep look at the media market structure and value chains in the member state, ownership, concentration processes and financial sources, who is financing what. Ownership, transparency rules were just mentioned. These are essential. We want to dig into who owns what. Then overview of all ownership, transparency rules and their effectiveness in reality in different European countries. Then there is all the question of the economics of media pluralism, relation between pluralism and competition, pluralism and efficiency. There are more economical issues, multi-sided market dynamics, the importance of advertising in respect to the news. Then the question of state funding and the market dynamics. And then these are the major questions on the economics of media pluralism. Then obviously, and that's why we are putting also in our group engineers and the specialists of the new ICT world, there are the technological developments and their effect on pluralism and freedom. Here we feel as was already said by the speakers before me, that there are opportunities, but there are also challenges for quality journalism in this new world. And anyway, there is no question that the new media have an important impact on the economics of on media pluralism and also on the quality and the development of journalistic activity. As a final group of themes, let me mention the political dimension. Political dimension has different angles. There is the institutional organization of the media policy and rulemaking, because we see policy and rulemaking, government structure as a special issue, the level of governance of the media, the relationship among media, electronic communication and competition rules, all the question of how the rules are organized. And then there is the question of media and politics, the media in the democratic process, the interrelation between politics, business and media, that is a specific application of the ownership, transparency, economic discussion that I was mentioning before. And then a key point we want to have a look is the independence of media regulators. Was said before that regulation in this sector should never done by the government, should never done by the political, but should have an independent, a technical independence characteristic is one of the points that we wanted to really investigate. And then finally, there is the global dimension of media pluralism, and this conference is about also the global dimension, cross-border concentration, global relevant media markets, and the global media societies, and then what are the issues for a regulatory policy for global media, and this also for the European Commission, that is a supranational organization, is an important point of reflection. These are the main themes on which we want to work. If I wanted to summarize them in some very essential way, I would say that we are going to look into two general speaking areas. One of external pluralism, source diversification, ownership, and market concentration. How we have a plurality of voices. And then some sort that we could define a sort of internal pluralism, that is the media governance, the ethics, the liability, censorship and self-censorship, and investigative journalism, how the media enterprise works. These two aspects, external and internal pluralism, we think that are the defense for a true freedom of expression organization of the media. Let me go very quickly, but an overview of what we are going to do very quickly. How we plan to do the things I'm saying. We plan to do these things in 4 ways. Obviously, we're a university, so we'll have a research activity. Then we have debates, education and training, and dissemination of results. Let me quickly mention what we are going to do in these different areas. We are going to have a working paper series that will be part of our research activity. Then we'll have a policy study that we are going to write under explicit request of the European Commission. I will come to this back in a second. Then we have a couple of observatories that we are building. One of best practices on pluralism, and another is an idea of a media profiler. We want to create, at least conceptualize the idea of how media can be studied and in a way auto-defined through different major issues. We are going to do an initial study on this, and then we'll see the results. Something like this was done for European voters during the 2009 election. With the same techniques, we are going to study media definition on content. Then we have a debate activity. This symposium is part of our debate activity. Our next workshop will be at the end of April, and I'll come back in a second on this. Then we'll have a major policy conference that will wrap up the first year of our activity in October. Then, as I say, we'll have education and training is an important part of our activity, being in a university. We'll have, during the whole year, academic seminars at the Institute, to which we'll invite experts from all Europe or from general expert of the field. Then we have, this important is an experiment, a summer school on freedom and pluralism of traditional and new media. This will be done in June, is already opening. You'll find, if you want to inform people, you'll find a leaflet in your, you have it in your hands. It will be during June and will be essentially for journalists and media practitioners. And then we'll have special events like today's conference. Dissemination result, we have just put on a new website. You can have a look. We'll try to have it informative and as rich as possible. Then we'll have a newsletter we are organizing, a blog, and we'll have a presence on social networks. Let me come very quickly on a couple of the things that are at the moment on our major attention. The first is this policy study for the Commission. The Commission has told us to do some background work for them to later consider if there is a space for a recommendation, a communication on policy issues. And what they are asking us is to study the Commission competencies in respect of media pluralism and media freedom. So they are really wondering about their own competencies, what is their own possibility to intervention. So we have here a first design of this study as we want to organize it. We'll have to do it by June, so we'll have to run a little bit. So we are thinking to work on the framing of media pluralism and justification of its policy significance in the European Union today. Then we'll concentrate on the legal analysis and perspective on the used instruments to foster media pluralism. Then we look at the current state of media pluralism in the Union, both on the social and political aspect and on the economic aspects. Then we look into EU Commission soft and hard law instruments for media pluralism and media freedom, because we think that is not only a question of hard law, but also of soft law, of instruments to develop. And then we'll conclude on an outlook of the media pluralism in Europe. On this paper, on this work, we want to concentrate this, as I say, the end of the year in October. We think a policy conference to discuss the result of this study that will be our major effort on a research activity during the year. Let me mention the next workshop. We'll have it at the end of April, and it's an interesting idea that I think, because we want to have a deep look at the definition of pluralism in the media sector. So we want to call on all the European projects that have an interdisciplinary approach, and they've been looking at the media pluralism definition, essentially in an area of converging media as we are. So we want to kind of make a general summary, a comparison of previous research, trying to have some answers on the methodological aspect of pluralism assessment and measurement. So it will be essentially a methodological effort, but we think it's important if we want to understand better media pluralism. Then, as I said, in summer we'll have this summer school. Let me just mention that this will be essentially for journalists. We'll ask experts from all Europe to contribute to this school. The topic will be freedom of expression in the media on a legal perspective. Then we'll have a special day on investigative journalism. Then we'll look at the new media challenge for journalists. Then we'll have an economic day on plurality of business model for the media, and then a final day on current trends and outlook for media pluralism. So this will be, we think that is an interesting program for a summer school. We'll see how will be the response of journalists. The Commission is very interested in this. This is one of the core, this idea to have a school that brings journalists from all the different member states and create also a network of discussion and then an occasion maybe of alumni, of networking also for the future. Well, let me finish on today's conference. The important themes were already proposed. Clearly, there is this discussion of the balance between freedom of expression and hate speech. How is possible to counter hate speech without limiting freedom of expression? That's obviously one of the themes we'll have to discuss in this conference. We'll have many sessions to discuss, to try to find an equilibrium. I think that the issue of how media regulation can be strengthened to counter hate speech is a major issue, but we have to be careful if this could be a self-defeating instrument if we don't manage the right equilibrium. Then we think that the role of pluralistic media to prevent hate speech is also an important element to discuss. We think that the more the media are able to represent social and cultural diversity, the more they are able to spread by this simple representation a message of tolerance, of existing of difference. And just by this they can contribute to give citizens effective tools to counter hate speech. So we think that media diversity is essential in preventing hate speech. Pluralistic media are at the core of this cure of this kind of hate speech ideas. Then we think that another issue that should be in the conference is media education. We should consider the importance of educating people, especially the youngest generation, to the fair use of media. We think that the fair use of media is already a beginning of the answer to many of the problems. Then, it was already introduced by Frank LaRue, there is the question of new media. Cyber hate is an increasingly worrying phenomenon, but also internet plays a key role in giving minorities more opportunities of expression. Internet is a really important piazza for everybody, and that's the point of equilibrium. So we should deepen the reflection about new media business model and sustainability and how this contribute. We think that we, as a new center, we have been established to develop and test new ideas on media pluralism. Will contribute to the debate on how to defend freedom of expression and contrast all forms of incitement to racism, hate, and discrimination. And we think that the idea to have this first conference of the center co-organized with all the other partners that you know on this issue is a very good signal about the fact that we want to work on pluralism and freedom of expression, but with an attention to all the major issues and to all the equilibrium that this issue has to have. We'll be on, as I said, we have a new website. We'll be on the new media, so you can follow us there. Thank you very much for the attention.